Mike woke up that Saturday morning with a big smile on his face. For the first time in 3 weeks, he didn't have to rush to the police station. No emergency calls, no paperwork waiting on his desk, and no meetings with the mayor about budget cuts. Just him, his coffee, and a beautiful quiet morning. His wife Lisa was still sleeping when he quietly slipped out of bed at 6:30. She deserved the rest too. Being married to the county sheriff meant she dealt with plenty of late-night phone calls and canceled dinner plans. Mike tiptoed to the kitchen, made his coffee extra strong, and looked out the window at his backyard. That old fence was staring right back at him, practically begging to be fixed. 3 of the wooden panels were so rotten you could poke your finger right through them. Winter had been tough this year, with ice storms and heavy snow that seemed to go on forever. The fence had taken a beating, and now it looked like something from a haunted house movie. Mike had been putting off this project for months. Every weekend, something came up. A robbery at the gas station, a missing teenager, a domestic dispute that needed his personal attention. That's the thing about being sheriff in a small town. You're never really off duty. People know where you live, and they're not shy about knocking on your door when they need help. But today was different. His deputy chief had promised to handle everything unless the town was literally on fire. Mike had even turned off his work phone and left it charging in the bedroom. Today was fence day, whether that old wood liked it or not. He'd already bought all the supplies last weekend. Cedar panels that matched the existing fence, galvanized nails that wouldn't rust, and a new post digger because his old one finally gave up the ghost. Everything was sitting in his garage, waiting for this exact moment. Mike finished his coffee and walked outside. The morning air was perfect, cool enough to work in but warm enough that he didn't need a jacket. Birds were singing in the oak tree that sat right between his yard and his neighbor's. For a moment, everything felt exactly the way life should feel. He'd lived in this house for 8 years now, ever since he got promoted from deputy to sheriff. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, and a backyard big enough for Lisa's vegetable garden and his tool shed. The neighborhood was the kind of place where kids still rode bikes in the street and neighbors borrowed cups of sugar from each other. Most people on Maple Street knew what Mike did for a living, but he tried to keep work and home separate. No uniform at home unless he absolutely had to wear it. No patrol car in the driveway on weekends. Just regular Mike, doing regular guy things like fixing fences and mowing grass. The only person who might not know about his job was Karen, the woman, who'd moved in next door about 3 months ago. She seemed nice enough, always working in her garden and keeping her yard looking like something from a magazine. They'd waved at each other plenty of times and made small talk about the weather, but they'd never really had a long conversation. Mike noticed Karen was already outside watering her flowers. She was wearing gardening gloves and had her hair tied back in a ponytail. Her yard looked perfect, like she spent hours every day making sure every blade of grass was exactly the right height. Mike's yard was neat, but it definitely had that lived-in look that comes from actually using your backyard instead of just looking at it. He grabbed his wheelbarrow and started loading it with tools. Hammer, crowbar, level, measuring tape, and safety glasses, because Lisa always reminded him to protect his eyes. The sound of metal tools clanking together echoed across the quiet morning. A few houses down, someone started a lawnmower, and the familiar Saturday morning symphony began. The fence project wasn't complicated, but it would take most of the morning. 3 panels needed to come out completely, and 1 post was loose enough that it probably needed to be reset. Mike had done plenty of fence work over the years. Growing up on his grandfather's farm, he'd learned that good fences really do make good neighbors, especially when you take the time to build them right. He started with the worst panel, the one that looked like it might fall over if a strong wind came through. The wood was so soft from rot that his crowbar went through it like it was made of cardboard. This fence had served its time, but it was definitely ready for retirement. Mike was making good progress on the first panel when he heard someone calling his name. The voice sounded different than usual, kind of sharp and upset. He looked up from his work and saw Karen standing on her side of the fence with her hands on her hips. "Mike," she called out again. "What in the world are you doing over there? He wiped the sweat off his forehead with the back of his hand and walked over to where she was standing. Karen looked pretty worked up about something. Her face was red, and she kept pointing at the fence like it had personally hurt her feelings. "Morning, Karen," Mike said, trying to keep things friendly. "Just fixing up these old fence panels. Winter really did a number on them." "Fixing them?" Karen's voice went up a notch. "It looks like you're tearing the whole thing down. You can't just destroy our fence without talking to me first." Mike blinked a few times. Our fence? He'd never thought of it that way. But he could see how someone might get confused about property lines. It happened all the time in his line of work. Neighbors getting into arguments over who owned what. "Well, actually," Mike said, still keeping his voice calm and steady, "this fence is on my property. We had it surveyed when we bought the house, but I understand why you might be concerned about it." Karen shook her head like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "That's not right, Mike. I've been looking into this since I moved in. Property, fences are shared between neighbors. That's just how it works. You can't make decisions about it by yourself." Mike could tell this conversation was heading in a direction that might not end well. He'd seen this exact same situation play out dozens of times. Two neighbors, both absolutely sure they were right, both getting more upset by the minute. The trick was to stay calm and stick to the facts. "I hear what you're saying, Karen, but I've got the paperwork that shows the fence is entirely on my side of the property line. I'm happy to show it to you if you'd like to see it." "I don't need to see your paperwork," Karen shot back. "I know what I know, and what I know is that you're making a terrible racket at 7 in the morning. You're destroying property that affects both of us, and you didn't have the courtesy to even mention it to me." Mike glanced at his watch. It was actually almost 8:30 now, well within the city's noise ordinance hours. He'd been careful about that because he knew how sound carried in the morning air. "Karen, I started around 7, which is perfectly legal according to city rules. And like I said, I'm just replacing the rotten panels with new ones. The fence will look better than it has in years when I'm done." "Legal?" Karen's voice was getting louder now. "Did you get permits for this work? Did you check with the city about tearing down structures?" "I don't think you did, Mike. I think you just decided to do whatever you wanted without following the proper procedures." Now Mike was starting to feel a little frustrated himself. He'd actually called the city office last week to double-check the rules about fence repairs. Basic maintenance and replacement didn't require permits, as long as you weren't changing the height or location of the fence. "I did check with the city, Karen. Fence repairs like this don't need permits. I'm not building anything new or changing the property line. I'm just fixing what's already here." Karen crossed her arms and gave him a look that could have frozen water in July. "That's not what I heard when I called them yesterday. They told me that any work involving shared property boundaries requires notification to adjacent property owners." Mike realized that Karen had been planning this conversation. She'd done her homework, or at least she thought she had. The problem was her homework was based on the wrong information. The fence wasn't on the property boundary, it was completely on his side of the line. "Look," Mike said, trying one more time to keep things peaceful. "Why don't I grab the survey documents from inside the house? We can look at them together and clear this whole thing up." "I don't have time for that right now," Karen said, waving her hand dismissively. "What I have time for is stopping you from continuing this destruction until we can get this sorted out properly." "Karen, I'm not destroying anything, I'm improving it." "That's your opinion," she replied. "My opinion is that you're being inconsiderate and possibly breaking several city ordinances. If you don't stop this work right now, I'm going to have to call someone who can make you stop." Mike felt his jaw tighten a little bit. In all his years of dealing with difficult people, he'd learned that threats usually meant the conversation was over. People who were willing to listen didn't jump straight to calling authorities. "That's your choice, Karen," he said quietly. "But I'm going to continue working on my fence on my property." Karen stared at him for a long moment, like she couldn't believe he wasn't backing down. Then she turned around and marched back toward her house, muttering something under her breath that Mike was probably better off not hearing clearly. Mike watched her go, then picked up his hammer again. He'd been sheriff long enough to know that some people just couldn't be reasoned with, no matter how polite you tried to be. Karen had made up her mind about the situation before she'd even talked to him. The morning was still beautiful, the fence still needed fixing, and he still had a whole day ahead of him. Whatever Karen decided to do next, Mike figured he'd deal with it when it happened. Mike went back to work on the fence, trying to push the argument out of his mind. He had 2 more panels to replace, and the morning was getting warmer. The sooner he finished, the sooner he could go inside and enjoy a cold drink with Lisa. But Karen had other plans. About 20 minutes later, Mike heard her voice again. This time she wasn't talking to him, she was talking to someone on the phone. And she was talking loud enough for half the neighborhood to hear. "Hello, yes, I need to report a problem with my neighbor," Karen was saying from her backyard. Mike could hear every word clearly, even though he was trying not to listen. Mike stopped hammering and wiped his hands on his jeans. Was she really doing what he thought she was doing? "He's destroying property without permission," Karen continued, her voice getting more dramatic with each word. "I tried to talk to him about it, but he got aggressive with me and refused to stop." Mike's eyebrows went up. Aggressive? He'd been nothing but polite to her, even when she started raising her voice at him. But he kept listening, curious to see how far this was going to go. "Yes, I'll hold," Karen said to whoever was on the other end of the line. While she was waiting, Mike could hear her pacing around her patio. Her flip-flops were making that slapping sound against the concrete with each step. She was clearly worked up about this whole situation. "Okay, I'm back," Karen said when someone picked up the line again. "Like I was saying, my neighbor is tearing down our shared fence without getting proper permits. When I asked him to stop, he became hostile and told me he didn't care what I thought." Mike shook his head. That wasn't even close to what had happened. But he'd heard people bend the truth before when they were upset. Karen seemed to genuinely believe her version of events. "The noise started at 7 this morning," she went on. "Bang, bang, bang with a hammer. It woke me up from a sound sleep. I have to work tomorrow and I need my rest. This is completely unreasonable." Mike glanced at his watch again. It was now almost 9 o'clock. Even if he had started at 7, which was perfectly legal, that would mean he'd been working for 2 hours. Hardly the marathon construction project Karen was making it sound like. "He claims he doesn't need permits," Karen said, and Mike could hear the doubt in her voice like she was talking about someone who claimed the earth was flat. "But I've been researching property law online and I know that's not true. You can't just tear down structures that affect your neighbors without following proper procedures." Mike had to give Karen credit for being thorough, even if she was wrong. She'd clearly spent time looking into this, which explained why she'd been so confident during their argument earlier. "I want a police officer sent out here immediately," Karen said, her voice getting more insistent. "This man is breaking the law, and he's being completely unreasonable about it. I'm afraid of what he might do next if someone doesn't stop him." "Afraid?" Mike looked down at his hammer and safety glasses. He was a middle-aged guy in old jeans and a t-shirt, fixing a fence on a Saturday morning. If that was scary, then Karen had a very different definition of threatening behavior than most people. "My address is 412 Maple Street," Karen said, "and please hurry. He's still out there making noise and destroying property." Mike heard her hang up the phone and start pacing again. Part of him wanted to laugh at the whole situation, but another part of him felt bad for Karen. She was obviously stressed out about something, and the fence project had just become the target for all that frustration. He'd seen this kind of thing before in his work. People would get overwhelmed by life, job stress, money problems, family issues, and then some small thing would set them off. They'd call the police about neighbors playing music too loud, or kids riding bikes on the sidewalk, or someone parking in the wrong spot. It was never really about the music or the bikes or the parking. It was about feeling like they had no control over anything else in their lives. Mike wondered what was really bothering Karen. Moving to a new neighborhood after what was probably a difficult situation couldn't be easy. Maybe she was just trying to establish some sense of control in her new environment. But understanding why someone was acting a certain way didn't mean you had to put up with false accusations and threats. Mike had been nothing but respectful to Karen, and she'd responded by calling the police and making up stories about him being aggressive and hostile. He picked up his hammer and went back to work on the fence. Whoever responded to Karen's call would figure out pretty quickly that there was no emergency here. Just a guy fixing his fence and a neighbor who didn't like the sound of hammering. Mike pulled out another rotten board and tossed it onto his growing pile of old wood. The new panel was going to look great once he got it installed. Cedar was such a nice wood for fencing. It would last for years and weather to a beautiful gray color. From Karen's yard, he could hear her moving around, probably watching him through her window to see what he was doing. Mike just kept working. He had a fence to fix, and no amount of drama from next door was going to stop him from finishing the job. Mike was just finishing up the second panel when he heard the familiar sound of a police cruiser pulling into his driveway. The engine had that particular rumble that all patrol cars seemed to have, and the slight squeak of brakes that needed just a tiny bit of work. He looked up from his work and saw Deputy Rachel Torres stepping out of the car. Rachel had been working with his department for about 5 years now, and she was one of the best officers he'd ever worked with. Smart, fair, and really good at calming people down when they were upset about something. Mike watched as Rachel looked around the yard, taking in the scene. She was doing exactly what he'd trained all his deputies to do: get a feel for the situation before talking to anyone. Her eyes moved from the pile of old fence boards to the new panels leaning against his garage, then to Mike standing there, with his hammer. "Good morning," Rachel called out as she walked toward him. Mike could see the exact moment when she recognized who she was looking at. Her professional expression shifted just slightly, and he caught the tiniest hint of a smile at the corner of her mouth. "Morning, Deputy Torres," Mike replied, setting his hammer down on the ground. "I'm guessing you got a call about some kind of disturbance over here?" "That's right, sir," Rachel said, pulling out her notepad. She was being completely professional, which Mike appreciated. "I received a report about possible property damage and a neighbor dispute. I need to investigate the complaint." Before Mike could say anything else, Karen came rushing out of her house like she'd been watching from the window the whole time. Which she probably had been. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Karen said, hurrying across her perfectly maintained lawn. "I've been trying to get this man to stop destroying our shared fence all morning, and he just won't listen to reason." Rachel turned to face Karen, pen ready to take notes. "Ma'am, I'm Deputy Torres. Can you tell me exactly what's been happening here?" "Well," Karen began, and Mike could tell she'd been rehearsing this speech in her head while waiting for the police to arrive. "I was woken up at 7 this morning by loud hammering and banging. When I came outside to see what was going on, I found him tearing down our fence without any warning or permission." Mike noticed that Karen's version of events kept getting more dramatic each time she told it. Now he'd apparently woken her up, even though she'd been outside watering her plants when he started working. "I tried to talk to him about it," Karen continued, gesturing toward Mike like he was some kind of criminal. "I explained that he needed to get proper permits for this kind of work, and that he should have consulted with me before making changes to our shared property. But he became hostile and told me he didn't care what I thought." Rachel wrote everything down carefully, asking questions every now and then to get the details straight. What time did the noise start? How long had it been going on? Had there been any previous problems between the neighbors? Mike had to admit, Karen was a good storyteller. If he didn't know what had actually happened, he might have believed her version too. She sounded genuinely upset and concerned, like she was dealing with a neighbor from hell. "He claims he doesn't need permits," Karen said, shaking her head sadly. "But I've done my research, officer. I know that you can't just tear down structures that affect property lines without following proper procedures. What he's doing is illegal." Rachel finished taking notes and turned to Mike. "Sir, I need to get your side of the story. Can you tell me what's been happening here this morning?" Mike looked at Rachel, then at Karen, then back at Rachel. This was definitely one of the stranger situations he'd found himself in during his career in law enforcement. "Well, Deputy Torres," Mike said, choosing his words carefully, "I've been doing some routine maintenance on my fence this morning. A few of the panels got damaged over the winter, so I'm replacing them with new ones. Do you have permits for this work?" Rachel asked, still being completely professional. "I checked with the city office last week," Mike replied. "Basic fence repair and replacement doesn't require permits as long as you're not changing the height or moving the fence line. I'm just swapping out damaged panels for new ones." Karen made a little huffing sound. That's what he keeps saying, but I don't believe it. Rachel looked back and forth between them. Mike could see her trying to figure out what was really going on here. A neighbor dispute over fence work wasn't exactly unusual, but something about this situation seemed to puzzle her. "Sir, can I ask what you do for a living?" Rachel asked Mike. Mike glanced at Karen, who was listening to every word. "I work in law enforcement." "What kind of law enforcement?" Rachel pressed. Mike took a deep breath. This was about to get interesting. "I'm the county sheriff." The look on Rachel's face was priceless. Her eyebrows went up, and she blinked a few times like she was trying to process what she'd just heard. Karen, on the other hand, went completely silent. The color drained out of her face and her mouth opened and closed like she was trying to say something but couldn't figure out what. You're the sheriff?" Karen finally managed to stammer out. "That's right," Mike said gently. "Deputy Torres here works for me, and you just called the police department to report me to my own officers." The silence that followed Mike's revelation was so thick you could have cut it with a knife. Karen stood there frozen, staring at him like he'd just told her he was from another planet. Deputy Rachel looked like she was trying very hard not to laugh. But you're just," Karen stammered, pointing at Mike's old jeans and t-shirt. "You don't look like a sheriff. You're dressed like a regular person." Mike smiled gently. "Well, Karen, it's my day off. I don't usually wear my uniform when I'm doing yard work at home." Rachel cleared her throat professionally. "Ma'am, the sheriff is entitled to privacy when he's not on duty. He doesn't have to identify himself as law enforcement when he's working on his own property." Karen's face went through about 5 different shades of red. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I called the police. On the police." "Technically, you called the sheriff's department on the sheriff," Mike said, trying to keep things light. "But don't worry about it. Happens more than you'd think." That wasn't actually true. This was definitely a first for Mike, but he could see that Karen was mortified enough already. "Let me show you those property documents I mentioned earlier," Mike said, pulling out his phone. He'd taken pictures of the survey paperwork just in case something like this ever came up. "This shows the exact property line between our yards." He held the phone out so both Karen and Rachel could see the official survey map. The property line was clearly marked, and the fence was definitely on Mike's side of it, not by much, maybe 2 feet, but definitely on his land. "The whole fence belongs to me," Mike explained. "When the previous owners built it, they put it entirely on their own property to avoid any boundary issues with the neighbors." Karen studied the document on the phone screen, her expression changing from confusion to embarrassment to something that looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. "I also called the city planning office last week," Mike continued. "Basic fence maintenance and panel replacement doesn't require permits in our county. I'm not changing the height, the location, or the style of the fence, just fixing what's already here." Rachel made a few more notes in her pad. "Everything appears to be in order here. No laws have been broken and property maintenance is, well, within the homeowner's rights." Karen finally found her voice again. "I'm so sorry," she said, and Mike could hear the genuine regret in her words. "I had no idea who you were. I thought I was just trying to protect my property rights." "I understand," Mike said, and he really did. Property disputes can be stressful, especially when you're new to a neighborhood. You were looking out for your interests, which is perfectly natural. "But I made such a fool of myself," Karen said, covering her face with her hands. "I called 911 and made up all those things about you being aggressive and hostile. You were nothing but polite to me even when I was being difficult." Rachel closed her notebook. "Ma'am, filing a police report isn't something to be embarrassed about if you genuinely believe there was a problem. It's better to call and be wrong than to not call when you really need help." Mike nodded in agreement. "Rachel's right. You saw something that concerned you and you took action. That's what good neighbors do." "Good neighbors don't call the police on people who are just trying to fix their fence," Karen said miserably. "Good neighbors also don't let misunderstandings turn into bigger problems," Mike replied. "We talked it out, we cleared things up, and now we both know where we stand." That's how these things are supposed to work. Rachel put her notebook away and adjusted her belt. I think my work here is done. Everyone have a good rest of your Saturday. As Rachel walked back to her patrol car, Karen turned to Mike with an expression of pure embarrassment, mixed with something that might have been admiration. Is there anything I can do to make this up to you? She asked. Maybe I could help you finish the fence work or bring you some lunch. I make really good sandwiches. Mike smiled and picked up his hammer. Tell you what, Karen. How about you? Just call me Mike when I'm at home and we forget this whole thing ever happened. Deal, Karen said, looking relieved. And Mike, next time I have concerns about something, I'll come talk to you first before calling anyone else. That sounds perfect, Mike said. Good neighbors talk to each other before they talk to the authorities. As Rachel's patrol car disappeared down the street, Karen lingered by the fence. This is really embarrassing to admit, but I was actually kind of intimidated by you before I knew what you did for a living. You're this big, strong-looking guy, and I'm just a single woman living alone. When you wouldn't stop the fence work, I got scared. Mike set down his hammer and looked at her seriously. Karen, I'm sorry if I seemed intimidating. That was never my intention. Being sheriff means I deal with a lot of difficult situations, but I never want my neighbors to feel uncomfortable around me. No, Karen said quickly. You weren't intimidating at all. I was just, I don't know, new place, new neighbors, trying to figure out how everything works. I guess I overreacted. Moving is stressful, Mike said, especially when you're doing it alone. If you ever have questions about the neighborhood or need help with anything, just knock on the door. Lisa and I are always happy to help. Karen's face lit up. That's very kind of you, and I promise next time I'll bring cookies instead of calling the police. Mike laughed. Now that sounds like a much better plan. Over the next few months, Karen became one of the friendliest neighbors on Maple Street. She never again assumed. She knew everything about the people living around her, and Mike had one of the best stories to tell at the station for years to come.